Thank you all for having me today. So if you've been to my previous talks, I started with Victorian era, then we kind of narrowed in a little bit on Charles Dickens. And last year, while deep diving more into Dickens and his influence in Christmas, Washington Irving just kept popping up more and more. And like many of you in this room, you probably think of him solely as Rip Van Winkle, Sleepy Hollow. You may not have gone further into a lot of the other short stories that he's written because unless you really focused on American literature, he's sadly one of our authors we talk about and then just kind of pass along pretty quickly. But Washington Irving was a fascinating man, and he lived during fascinating times for America's history. And one of the things I find interesting is the fact that he started a lot of traditions that later writers would kind of pick up on and bring to the forefront. And you're just going to see the idea of Christmas in a modern sense really start with Washington Irving, go on to your Night Before Christmas poem, then into Charles Dickens, and forward. It's just going to avalanche into a bunch of writers kind of getting this idea of Christmas, wanting to escape from what they're seeing going on in their modern world, and trying to create this elaborate, cozy, wonderful picture of what they either assumed Christmas was like or what they wanted to create in their own homes. Washington Irving was born in, I always forget dates for some reason when it comes to birthdays, 1783, and he died in 1859. During that span in American history, you have a new republic becoming a continental power. We have the Louisiana Purchase. You see us fighting some wars. We have the War of 1812, we have the Indian Wars, and then we also have the Mexican-American War. During that time period, you see the Industrial Revolution. You see rural life and urban life kind of combating with each other, especially as you see the Industrial Revolution span into your rural settings. You see social reform, political reforms, upheavals, calmer times, and sadly, by the time we get to 1859, we can pretty much see that America is going towards one track and one track alone, and that's going to be the Civil War. So during this time period, with your authors writing about holidays, they're often going back to this kind of warm, fuzzy, glowing feeling time period and saying, all right, how can we capture that, not just in our writings, but practices in our homes, and basically escape from the realities that we may not be too comfortable with that's going on around us during this time period. If you've ever read any of Washington's short stories, especially some of his earlier works, the man loved New York City. That's where he was born. He does live abroad. He lives in England for a while. He's actually, at one point, our U.S. ambassador to Spain. But New York City is his home. He's born there, and he's going to die in that area. He is what a lot of people consider your first true city slicker. He also coined some phrases that are still used today. Most people, when they think of New York, they might think of Gotham. He also coined the phrase Knickerbocker, which some people, I'm sorry, I'm from the South, I don't quite understand that one. Some from New York City might, yeah, there you go. So it's interesting to see that when he does his writings, the Christmas stories are set in England. Now, keep in mind, he is the son of two immigrants. His mother was from England, his father was from Orkney, Scotland. They are a mercantile family. His brothers are all going to go into mercantile trade business. He's going to have a relatively easy life in some extent until there's a financial failure within the family business. And that's when his writing, which he had been doing at that point, really takes forefront. And he dives into it and he starts creating literature that is well respected not just in America, but he is also one of the first American authors that the English finally go, okay, he has talent. We enjoy what he's writing. I personally think one of the reasons for that is when he does his short stories, it's a whole compile of the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. He talks about an English Christmas in about 5, we'll call them chapters or short stories. He goes to Bridge Manor, which is based off of Ashton Hall, and that's in Birmingham, England. And in this hall, you have the squire and his family, They have Christmas Eve festivities. They have Christmas Day festivities. There's a lot of merrymaking. And if you get a chance to read those short stories, and if you have any knowledge of previous Christmas traditions, you're going to see that he's basically writing about rural traditions that would have been performed in England during even the Tudor time period. For instance, they bring in a pig's head or boar's head as decoration to the table, and it's decorated. You go way back in time, and boar's head would have been a decoration and nibbled upon a treat for your Christmas table. Of course, turkey, goose will also be eaten. They have mincemeat pie, and we'll talk a little more about the cuisine and how it would have been made in a little bit. They're going to have various types of drinks, wassail. I made a non-alcohol version of wassail. There are so many recipes for wassail. You can take your pick. You can do an ale base, you can do a wine base, or you could do a hard cider base, or just apple juice today. But it's going to have a lot of spice in it as well. Oftentimes, throughout history, you're going to, especially if you're not of a certain class, times are going to be lean and green throughout most of the year. But when you get to celebratory times like Christmas, which originally for most of your cultural groups in Europe and England, you're celebrating the birth of Christ, you're going to basically kind of hold back until you get to Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and then you have the 12 days of Christmas where you're basically going to let your hair down and enjoy yourselves. We'll even see those of more working classes, peasant classes, bringing greenery into their home. They're finally going to be able to let themselves have food items that they may not be able to afford or acquire throughout the year. And if you go into the squire homes, the feasting is going to be on a much larger scale. And that is what Washington Irving is pretty much talking about through the whole time that he's doing these short stories. The character, Geoffrey, is basically a narrator. And it's supposed to be, you're on a travel with him. He's like a travel journalist for the 17 and 1800s. And one of my favorite things about Washington Irving is he would create these characters and he would write as if they were real. And some folks would believe it. Others would realize it's very tongue-in-cheek how he's writing a couple times. For instance, when he did the history of New York, he had it that it was a Dutch historian that compiled this, and that he went missing. And that they were looking for him because they had to pay for his lodgings. And the public believed this story. So by the time they were ready to release the history of New York, it had gained such a following. People were like, we don't know who this missing Dutchman is, but we need to read this history book. We need to figure out what this man was researching that he went missing mysteriously. It was a very good marketing ploy. And that's the other thing that amazes me with Washington is he was able to read the public. And later in life, he doesn't do as well with some of his pieces he puts out, but along with writing literature, he also writes biographies, histories. The man is very well-rounded. He fights for copyrights for writers, and he also is able to get quite a bit of money back on things that he produced by doing second editions and author revised editions. Very smart, especially since if you look at that era, there's a lot of authors that just struggled their whole entire life to meet men's meat. Who did he know? He knew Mary Shelley. He knew Sir Walter Scott. He was friends with Charles Dickens, very briefly. Dickens is going to use him for a lot of inspirations, and he openly admits that Washington Irving helped inspire a lot of facets that are in the Christmas story. I don't know if this has any connection or not, but ironically, one of Washington Irving's brothers' name was Ebenezer. I don't know if that works its way in, or ironically, Ebenezer was a popular name during that era. So it could just be they were like, that just sounds like a miserly name, let's go with it. Now, when it comes to preparing and cooking your meals, during Washington Irving's time, it's the same as what you're going to see during Dickens' time. You do have cooking stoves coming about, but they are not a mainstay in a lot of homes, including your wealthier homes. Hearth cooking is still going to be the main way that you are preparing your meals during this time period. With your hearth, you may have gone to or historical sites. You're going to have a crane even going over, maybe 2 cranes that you can swing over. If you don't have cranes, you have an apparatus you can put over, but your fire is going to be your main source with the hot coals underneath. If you want to directly cook over the fire, that's really just going to be boiling and roasting. But if you want to bake, and if you did not have a brick bake oven, Dutch kettles, which we typically call them today, or bake kettles, are often what you're going to find in homes during this time period. If you've ever gone camping, you may have used one of these forms of Dutch kettles. It's got the legs underneath, the lid is indented. That's how you shovel the hot coals underneath and the hot coals on top. And you're going to heat that piece up so that it's going to have lovely radiant heat, so that when you open it and put your item inside and close it up, you're just going to keep maintaining those hot coals around it. It will bake your item up. And ironically, baking time is very similar to if you put it in an oven between 350 and 375 in your home oven today. Not using convection, but just using regular heat in it. If you want to do cookies, you can also see people just plopping them down into the bottom of the bake kettles. If you were lucky enough to have a bake oven, typically you're going to fire it up, and you're not going to fire it up just for like a dozen cookies or a pound cake. You're going to make sure that as the oven temperature is falling, you're basically checking a list of items that can go into it. So you might start out with putting in your denser items like pound cakes and such. You may then put in your small cakes, which we typically call cookies today. As the temperature goes down further, you can also see them putting in fruits to dry. Seasonality is very important when it comes to what you're consuming during this time period. So even though citrus is a winter crop and you can get it fresh this time of the year, you're not going to be getting it fresh in the summertime like we're used to today. So when that oven starts drying down, that's the perfect time to either put in slices of peels. Another thing you could do is pierce the citrus fruit up towards the top. You don't want to go through the pith, but across the pith. Hang it up in a dry kitchen, and that will dehydrate it, and then you can zest it. In fact, the jumbles that I made have dried orange zest in them. It's not quite the potency that we're used to by using a fresh citrus, but if you use dried lemon and dried oranges, they almost acquire a spicier flavor to them, almost like a peppery, bitter flavor, which I find lovely. Some people may not. You also see sugar being used in homes as a preservative, not so much something that you're constantly going to dip into like we do today. So you can make candied peels and oranges. Now, a lot of your citrus, a lot of your spices, even your sugared items have multi-purpose use in your home. It's not just in your kitchen. Just like today, you might drink orange juice because you like the taste, but you're also drinking it to get the vitamins and minerals. People were doing the same thing 200, 300, 400 years ago. It's just their idea of how that item might be affecting you is a little different than our standards today, mainly because they don't have modern medicine. They're not aware of how things might be reacting with you internally. And they're basically basing most medicine on reaction. So if they give you something and you have a positive reaction, okay, maybe it worked. We don't know for sure. If you have a negative reaction, they'll be like, oh, well, maybe we should try this again. Keep in mind, sometimes they want you to have a negative reaction. Up until modern medicine, treating is usually for the humors, blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. So at certain time periods in history, they want you to throw up. They want you to have a blister on your arm. They may bleed you. Think of Washington. It's a totally different time period than what we're used to today. But again, a lot of these food items that we kind of take for granted today in our kitchens, cinnamon, allspice, nutmeg, these are spices that you would have seen in homes because folk might be using it in their cooking and baking, but they could also be using it in remedies. They might go to an apothecary or have a doctor come to their home and say, make this tincture. Here's what the recipe calls for. Do you have it in your home? America is settled by your Puritans in a lot of areas, but they're not the only group. We tend to somehow in early American history focus really on them. But when you look at your cultural groups that are settling in America, you do have your Puritans, but you also have your English that come over and settle. You have your German, your Irish, your Scottish, and your Dutch. And they're all going to kind of add their influences, not just to the kitchen and food items that we're used to today, but also some of their traditions. So back to that book that Washington wrote about the history of New York City. There's this section in it where he talks about a jolly gentleman flying in a wagon over the treetops. And he lands at a fire pit in front of some Dutch settlers. And he smokes a pipe. And the smoke goes up, and it basically creates this fantastical cityscape. And then he kind of, with a twinkle in his eye, almost, he lays his finger across his nose, puts his hat or pipe back in his hat, gets in his wagon, and flies off. That is Sinterklaas. So that would be your Dutch influence of basically a very jolly version of the Saint Nicholas. This book came out December 6th. That is Saint Nicholas's patron day. So Washington knew what he was doing when he did this, but that is your first time you see in America an idea of, I've got a bunch of little reproductions of Santa over here, of the Santa Claus that is going to evolve into the happy person that we think of today. And we're just going to go on a sidetrack right here. Just think of how Santa Claus has evolved in looks over the past 200 years. He's gone from this little elf-like jolly creature to a much taller person. Today, he might be sporting, excuse me, a six-pack and a rifle and taking out the demons that are trying to ruin Christmas. And his reindeer are these massive creatures that are pretty cool. And I have to admit, the one thing with modern traditions that I do agree is they're finally having the reindeer what they are, female. Reindeers with horns, female. I'm sorry. They're not males. So regardless their name, Vixen isn't the only girl that's pulling that sleigh out there. But, I mean, that's just right there. We, and not just this country, England, everywhere in the world, we're constantly morphing these non-religious icons of Christmas into what we want to see and what makes us feel comfortable or not comfortable in a sense. Now, with the Dutch influence, you're going to see certain type of cookies being produced around the holiday season that are pretty popular today along with your Germans, and that's going to be variations of gingerbread and molasses cookies. If any of you have had a chance, I sadly have not, but I have friends and I kind of lean on them whenever they go to the markets over in Europe. It's fascinating how many variations of gingerbread you will see in Germany, Belgium, Holland, all those countries over there. Even if you go to England, there's variations of gingerbread. You have York gingerbread, you have gingerbread that's a cookie, you have gingerbread that's a cake. The molasses variation's going to change in it, the spices are going to change in it. Whether or not Washington Irving ate gingerbread, alas, I have no proof that he ate it. And he doesn't really talk about it too much in his stories, but it would have been a very popular commodity and many Americans would have been familiar with it, especially since if you go to taverns, oftentimes taverns had gingerbread cookies. Now these are going to be flat, thin cookies. The gingerbread that are typically served at taverns, we had a recipe for one at Old Salem and Winston. It was more savory than it was sweet. And oftentimes they could be served because they're going to make you a little more thirsty. So if you're staying at that tavern, you're munching on them, you might want to order more to drink. Think of them as like the bar nuts that we have today. Now, meats. He does mention, like I said, the boar's head. But they also talk about a mincemeat pie and how glorious it is, along with a pheasant's pie. Now, game meat would have been eaten. If you've ever had a mincemeat pie in here, who's ever had a traditional mincemeat pie? See, you either love it or hate it. A modern mincemeat pie, if you're not going vegetarian, typically has suet within the crust itself and maybe suet within. But there probably won't be bits of meat in there. That's going to be your only protein source. Most of us today are going and we're getting our vegetarian version. So it's going to be a butter crust or a vegetable shortening crust, and then maybe vegetable shortening or butter within the filling of dried fruits and such. I highly recommend, unless you're a vegan or vegetarian, try a mincemeat pie with suet in the crust and suet inside. It does not taste like a beef pie. It just adds another level of richness. I mean, your heart won't be happy, but your tummy will be. Also, suet, to me, if you got suet, butter, and then your vegetable oil, it's the least to create a slick in your mouth, if that makes sense. Sometimes you eat things that have that heavy kind of Crisco, not knocking Crisco, but it has that heavy Crisco content to it. You're eating, you just feel like there's something left in your mouth. No matter how much you drink, it just kind of stays in there, where suet tends to kind of wash clean. Traditionally, though, your mincemeat pies would have had meat in it. It would have had maybe a gravy base and then your dried fruit added into it. Again, there's variations of recipes. Everyone's going to tweak it to their taste, and especially if you're in a wealthy household, you're going to tweak it to the patron's taste, whether you liked it or not, or the cook may have had issues with it. The pheasant pie that is mentioned is decked out with peacock feathers. So Jeffrey is at first like, what is this pie? And then he's like, is it a peacock pie? And they're like, no, in old it would have been a peacock pie, but today it's a pheasant pie, so we put the feathers into it to make it look as such. Again, you go back through history, we tend not to think about eating peacocks today, but peacock was a meat that was consumed. Swan was a meat that was consumed. Anything that moved, you consumed throughout history. You go back and there are going to be recipes that are going to make you go, I'm not so sure, but it's because it might not fit into what you have been raised culturally. You go to another cultural home, you go to another country, there might be an item that they just sit there and get excited about that you're going to be like, oh, but there's things that we might get excited about that they may just sit there and look at us and be like, I have no idea why you're eating that. That is disgusting. With the wassail, which we'll be able to sample over here, I went with a more apple-based history. Wassailing was typically, it could become quite rambunctious. It was meant to be your going and goodwill and chill, maybe to the apple orchard, maybe to your neighbors. It depended on the alcohol content, how excitable people would get. That's one of the passages that I do love in the sketchbook, is when they're talking about the food I did find exciting. That's my background. But then afterwards, the children, the youngsters are in another room. They're in the Great Hall, and they're playing all kinds of games, and they're getting rambunctious and crazy. And the adults are basically in another room, kind of calming down a bit, because they had been drinking a lot of wassail around the table. And the character mentions as the bowl goes around and people consume more and more, they're getting a little more jolly, a little more forgetful of what they're saying. So when they go into this other space and then you have the kids in the next room playing, it shows you a sign of Christmas that is also, in my opinion, starting to come pretty modern, which is the inclusion of family. So the character's sort of like, well, this is great with the adults, but he sneaks away and peeks in because he wants to see the kids playing. And the kids are playing with a gentleman of the house. He's got them doing Blind Man's Bluff, a couple other games. Then they actually go into mumming, which is where they play up as caricatures and come into the room. One is, I think, Miss Mincemeat Pie is her character. These are all very popular trends that you see way back in English history. Tudor time period up until basically your Protestant Reformation. A lot of these traditions were not seen as comfortably by your Protestants. They saw it as very Catholic. They saw it as a slippery slope. So there is going to be a time period even in England where a lot of these traditions, especially in urban settings, are kind of pushed out. And you're really going to see mumming, wassailing, and such like that kind of living on in rural communities. But by this time period, the 1700s, the early 1800s, you're starting to see resurgence of traditions. There's also in England called the Oxford movement, where you have English sitting there saying, perhaps not all of these Catholic traditions were horrible. Maybe we can merge some of these within a Protestant or our Church of England faith base. So it's hard to explain what all is going on socially during this time period, but basically Washington Irving is around at the same right time period to document and kind of get out to the forefront a lot of these ideas. Now with mumming, pig's head, pheasant, wassail, they are also eating fermentary, I can never pronounce that one. This one I'm not too keen on. It's wheat boiled in spiced milk. It's basically a very rich porridge. I don't really see this one staying too long outside of the sketchbook. It's mentioned in it, but spiced porridges, at least in my household, is something we don't really have on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, along with the ancient sirloin. That's another thing that was a dish that you would serve. It shows that you have quite a bit of wealth, that you can have beef to the table. But really, if you talk to a vast majority of people, they're going to tell you turkey, goose, or pork are going to be the meats that they are going to have at their tables during this time period. For him to be mentioning these two, he's basically delving way back into time and more exotic meats that would have been set to the table. Now, later in his life, with him having a more stable livelihood, especially in New York City, I'd like to think that he kind of engaged in some of these different Christmas traditions. But sadly, Washington Irving never married. He was actually engaged pretty young, and his fiancée died before their wedding. He kind of held a torch for her throughout his life. There was an interest at one point, but it didn't work out for him. He did not have children, therefore, but he did have a pretty close-knit family. I'd like to think that he wrote about these and tried to implement some of these traditions in his home. We don't really, at least not that I've seen in my research thus far, really the documents like you have with Charles Dickens trying to reenact a lot of his characters' livelihood, like the whole Christmas feast within their home themselves. But America is also a slightly harder group to sell the Christmas story to. Who were we just at war with in 1783? The English. So even though Americans enjoyed the sketchbook, it's English traditions. So they're going to read it and be like, okay, we can try some of this. And that is picturing this beautiful light, but he's a squire. He lives in a mansion. Okay, isn't that what we don't want in this country? You also don't have a prominent group of all English. You have, again, your Dutch, you have your German, you have other groups that are going to be bringing in Christmas traditions. So when you read the sketchbook, don't assume that that is what all Americans are suddenly doing in their home. They're going to take bits and pieces of it. What you're also going to see Americans doing is taking bits and pieces from these other cultural groups. So from your Germans, they're creating these elaborate things called putzes in their homes, which are nativity scenes. A lot of these over time will evolve into like little Christmas villages and such that we like to put in our houses, or some people still today like to put an elaborate nativity scene in their home. You're going to see the idea of caroling. A lot of your Christmas songs are going to come out of your various cultural groups and what they have singing on Christmas Eve and during the 12 days of Christmas up to Epiphany. You're going to see from your Germans also the Christmas tree. That will come about. Early on, it might be just something like a tiered pyramid, which you would decorate on Christmas Eve for the children the next day. Both the Dutch and the German were into gift giving. And again, this would have been typically Christmas Eve. Christmas isn't until Christmas Eve, historically. It's not like we celebrate it today, where we kind of are throwing Halloween even under the curb and just saying, yay, we had fall for 2 weeks, let's go straight into Christmas. When it came to gift giving, what you would have seen Washington Irving getting as a small child or older as an adult, what you would have seen Charles Dickens giving his children and stuff, are not all these elaborate presents wrapped in under a tree like we think of today. They're going to be what we would consider simple pleasures in a lot of households. It's going to be apples and oranges. It might be some of those candied fruit peels that you made for the children to have, or they may go to a merchant and buy some candy to give them. There may be a new toy or two, but oftentimes it's going to be handmade, especially if you're in a rural setting. They're going to light the tree, the pyramid, the tier that they have with candles, and then the children will come in and it's surprised and it's decorated. If you are lucky enough to live in an area where you could get gold foil, we also see gold foiled nuts being kind of scattered about, or candied nuts, think of your almonds, would be given as a gift. The idea of elaborate gift giving is really only going to be on your upper level of society throughout history until more modern times. And you can thank the Industrial Revolution for that. As we progress in, we become better and better at mass producing, price comes down, hence why we're able to give on a level in the last 100 years that you were not able to see for previous generations. So yes, if you go back through history, let's say the Tudor court, Henry VIII is getting some magical gifts at Christmas time, but you go beyond that upper level and work your way down, they're not going to be exchanging those gifts like we think of today. I think it's, what movie is it? The Lion in the Winter with Katharine Hepburn. I love that movie, don't get me wrong, it's not accurate. But the scene where she's like rapping with the Christmas tree, I'm like, what is happening right now? They would have had a Christmas celebration, but not quite the extent where she's berating Henry for his treatment of her and her children and wrapping Christmas trees or presents under a Christmas tree. That's going to come a little later on. Think Victoria and Albert. Christmas trees were around before them, but because they're the popular young couple with the very wonderful, trendy family, look at how we study the royals today. Americans are like, ooh, I want what Victoria and Albert have. Look, they're so perfect. They love each other and they love their children. Now, before I go any further, does anybody have questions on things that I know it's kind of a lot of history condensed in. Someone did bring in, I do want to mention this real quick. I wasn't really going to talk about Sleepy Hollow because I feel like it gets a lot, but someone did bring in a picture of the Sleepy Hollow Church, which Washington had, there was a smallpox. Was it smallpox or yellow fever? Forgive me for not remembering which one. There was a blight that came to New York City, and his family had to send them out. And he ended up going to what will become Sleepy Hollow. It had a nickname at that time called Sleepy Haven, and he stayed in this town, and the town's name was, forgive me forgetting, North Tarrytown, New York was the original name for it. And later on, due to the story and nativity, it's a beautiful area too, so if you get a chance to go, but when he went, yes.
He's buried right behind that church.
Yes.
The Irving Cemetery.
Yes.
Plot is right there. So is the Van Tassel.
Yes.
Plot is right next to it.
I mean, it's really, one thing I will say, and again, maybe I'll do a Washington Irving Halloween talk someday, but the folklore, if you get outside of New York City into that, again, with your various cultural groups, there's some interesting folklore, which is going to help to stimulate his brain for Rip Van Winkle, Sleepy Hollow, Headless Horseman. I have to admit, Christmas today is a very fun, loving, safe environment. Has a very dark history throughout, and it was actually a time for telling ghost stories, hence the Christmas story. And it's fascinating to see that throughout history there was always this little bit of an edge to it. You had characters like Black Peter, Belsnickel. So you have this jolly Santa Claus, but then you have his sidekick who, if he doesn't like you, you might be going to horror upon horror Spain. Keep in mind, he's with Protestants that have this issue, because you're going to Catholic Spain, or you might be dragged to hell. These are kids. I mean, I think today a lot of parents would have issues with the parenting of that era and how you made your children behave, but you also weren't able to watch your children and track them on your cell phones like we can today. So perhaps you needed to instill a little bit of horror into them. I do want to take a side note just to kind of remind people while we're thinking on the greatness of Christmas, that it wasn't for everyone during this time period. So along with all this advancement we're seeing in the world and in New York City, we're sadly also seeing a growing trend of children working labor. Women are working in manufacturing, which I'm not saying women shouldn't work, but the conditions for men, women, and children, not good. You're going to see tenements basically coming about. You're going to see gang riots during this time period with an influx of various people coming in and not wanting to communicate with each other. You're going to see New York City change from 1783 to 1759, like you're seeing the whole entire country change. So while there are times and things that are coming about Christmas traditions that are wonderful, we tend to sometimes in history focus too much on one aspect and forget about the realities of what is going on. And I tend to do more cultural studies than anything. And one thing is, when I'm studying Christmas or anything, I want to know what else is going on at the same time, because I don't always want to have this perfect, happy little bubble where I'm like, well, that's lovely. Everyone went around, they were wassailing, they were eating good food, there weren't starving children, there weren't horrible things going on at that time. And it's pretty sad, but it is reality. Now, for the food that I have over there, before I let y'all free to sample it, I did bring in some cookies, some of which obviously I bought from the store, because this is my way of showing you how the evolution of cookies and Christmas extend. You have, again, back in the day, you might have gingerbread, you might have a spiced Christmas cake, one type of cookie maybe in your home. Today, due to the vast majority of different ethnic groups in America, we have such a smorgasbord we can pick from when it comes to holiday fare. And this is just a small sampling over here. We might have food on our table that has Jewish origins, Italian origins, Mexican, Latin, Australian, African, Asian. It is amazing to think today what we can pull from when it comes to food sources. The jumble cookie that I made is a really old recipe. Jumbles go way back. It's a cookie where you're leavening them with air. You're not using baking powder or baking soda in them. So you're not going to use a handheld mixer traditionally. You're going to use your hand or a reed whisk. And you're going to whisk your butter and sugar till it's nice and light and fluffy. And the great thing about using your hand is the heat is actually going to help melt down that sugar. So compared to when you're using a KitchenAid mixer, unless you're putting like a slightly warm towel at the bottom to just melt it down a bit, you're going to kind of incorporate that sugar even more into that butter. You're then going to add into that your liquids, which is going to be 1 egg. If you lived in an area where you weren't able to get fresh eggs all the time, you could always rely on dried eggs or preserved eggs. Dried eggs, not so much. Preserved eggs, you're going to take ash and then you're going to put straw, put it down into the crock, and that's going to basically keep it sealed. Has anyone ever gotten fresh eggs before? Yes. Okay. So you know that when you get a fresh egg, they naturally have a sealant on them, which is going to keep them airtight. So as long as they weren't scrubbed and washed, the shell, prior to going in, they have that sealant. You're sealing them even further. They're not going to last indefinitely, but you will extend the life of your fresh eggs a little longer if you didn't have a hen, let's say, that's going to lay in the winter hours, because there were breeds that are only going to lay when it comes to sun and how many hours they have in the day. I use brandy or spiced whiskey. You could also use milk. It's only 2 tablespoons. It actually does not have a lot of liquid because you can see the origins of this being more or less a biscuit at one point in its history. It probably at one point in its history didn't have the high quota of butter and sugar in it as well. Flour could be whatever grain you have on hand. You might see variations of this where they're using rye, einkorn, any of the older grains, whatever was available, you would grind up and mix into this. And that's going to change the texture a bit. But by mixing it by hand and incorporating that air in, you're causing the batter to rise a bit within its baking. Now that said, if you did want leavening, you could use baker's ammonia in the sense. You could also use hartshorn, which is the inner part of a deer's antler. And these are all predecessors, pearl ash, of baking soda and baking powder as we have today. In fact, if you ever make spirally cookies, it often comes for baker's ammonia. And that's going to give it that whiteness. It's going to also help that dough really form nice and smooth, so when you imprint your design, it stays nice and sharp. It's not going to soften if you were using another type of chemical within it. The flavor is heavily spiced. I pulled back from using black pepper because I don't know how people are going to handle it, but a lot of your cookies during this time period have black pepper in them. It was just seen as another spice to put in. That's the other thing, and that's a prime example with your mincemeat pie. People weren't really separating sweet and savory historically like we tend to do in a modern sense today. So it was pretty common to have meat dishes with dried fruit in it. Good example, how many in here enjoy doing like sausage, onions, and cooked apples? I mean, that's pretty tasty. So you might want to try that savory mincemeat pie. The wassail, apple cider, spices, and I'm telling you that just in case someone's allergic. So it's apple cider, spices, orange juice, a smidgey of pomegranate juice, solely because I did not have any red wine, sorry, to splash in there. I wanted to give it that little bit of depth. It had lemon, and it also had some whiskey, which is cooked off. So you can drink this safely. There is no alcohol content to it. But a wassail, again, could be ale or wine-based. If you go with ale, go with a sweet, dark ale. And I actually recommend cooking that up and putting apples in it. If you have the chance, take those apples, put them on a grill them up that way, roast them in the oven, slice them up, put them in, add a little bit of apple cider juice to it, not apple cider vinegar. I've had people do that as a mistake. And just kind of get it to the sweetness that you like. It's actually really tasty. In the past, I've done some wassails with beer, and people were surprised that they enjoyed it. Wassail with wine, I tend to stay away from because I am just not a fan of hot mulled wine. It tastes too much like cold medicine to me. But your taste may go that route. You may actually enjoy it.